Thank you all for coming. We are on behalf of the University of Pennsylvania, the Center for Technology Innovation Competition, and the Warren Center, which I will leave to Rakesh to introduce properly in a moment. We would like to thank you for joining us for the second research conference on the economics of digital services. This is a fantastic opportunity to address what we think is a critical set of issues. We are in an era where due to enforcement and legal issues particularly around competition law, but even around just business issues, understanding the economics of digital services has never become more important. And what we found in talking with the community, that there was a real interest, a need, and a desire to foster a better understanding of how these business models work, what their effects are on the economy. And so Rakesh Vora, my partner in this venture, and I got together and decided to launch this initiative, which is based around, as those of you here know, a grant program intended to really promote both a large body of work, a growing body of work to study the issues that we all share an interest in, but also to promote a sense of community and to bring together as a focal point a chance for scholars working in similar areas and related fields to have a conference where we would bring them together and have discussions on areas of mutual interest. I would say that we have been delighted with how this has gone. It's been a fantastic opportunity for in the first 2 years, and we are really delighted with how it's going, and we are delighted to also be telling everybody it will be continuing into a third year, which the current call is outstanding. It ends on September 30th. So many of you who've actually submitted in year one did receive grants in year two, so it's you're by all means welcome to continue to submit. And if we can support the work that you're doing even more so, that would be terrific. In particular, we'd like to thank, this is all made possible by a generous grant from the Knight Foundation, which is supporting this, and so we owe them our thanks and their commitment to developing the kind of insightful research that really our society needs desperately right now. And in addition, we should tell you all there is a remote audience participating that will be listening, and they will have the opportunity to ask questions in written form through Q&A, which the moderator, which Rakesh and I will alternate doing, will intersperse questions from the remote audience along with questions from the people in the room. But just to be aware, there is a larger audience, including, as we know, a number of enforcement officials and congressional officials interested in the space. So again, part of this is a desire on the part of all of us to leverage to amplify the work we're doing, to find new audiences for it, and to make it as relevant to policymaking audiences as we can. Rakesh, would you like to say hello? Yes.
Let me add my welcome to Chris on behalf of the Warren Center for Network and Data Sciences, which is based in the School of Engineering. Let me advertise a little bit for Penn. Penn really encourages interdisciplinary work, and this event is an example of that. I hope very much that you enjoy it. Chris and I certainly look forward to hearing your papers.
Well, Rakesh not only speaks of our commitment to interdisciplinary work, but embodies it. He is one of the Penn Integrates Knowledge professors here at Penn, who he has two appointments, neither of which is secondary. He holds actually full primary appointments in both the engineering school and in the economics department, and has done breakthrough work. Something I've even shared with him, we're actually with a student I'm working on writing an extension of one of his papers that he's written on spectrum policy, and so it's a fascinating time to be working in this space. But I could keep prattling on and offering welcomes, but the most important thing is the substantive program itself. And we couldn't be more honored to have the first element of this program to be a keynote address from Tommaso Valletti. I will apologize in advance, just so you know, there's one logistical thing you will hear me do throughout the day, which is one of the things that lawyers have as a requirement is called continuing legal education. Medical professionals have the same. And we are offering this for CLE. And to verify that people actually attend the program, at the beginning of each session, we have to say a word that they have to write down and put on the CLE materials. And at the end of the session, we'll have to say another word. So it will seem a bit bizarre. The alternative would be to have them flash on the screen which we decided not to do, but you will have to see the tedious thing. And the first word for the first session, I will tell you right now, is technology for those of you who are doing this at home. But I apologize for this really mundane reality, but it's one of those things that, let's put it this way, if you had such a requirement, you'd be extremely grateful for it. But anyway. Going back to the most important thing, Tommaso Valletti is generously flown across the Atlantic Ocean on a momentous day from the United Kingdom, greeted by a plethora of television cameras desperate to get his opinion on the pressing issue of the day, which was not digital services, but was actually the late passing of Queen Elizabeth II, but on which he is no doubt a renowned expert as well. But more importantly for our case, our purposes, he is currently the professor of economics and head of department in the Department of Economics and Public Policy at the Imperial College Business School. He has numerous academic honors, which are worthy of note, but more importantly, he's been deeply involved in the interaction between economics and real-world policy implementation, having served as the chief competition economist at the European Commission in the DG Comp, and between 2016 and 19, but actually serving a number of roles in the UK now, including a non-executive director on the board of the UK Financial Conduct Authority, and a member of the panels of academic advisors of both the UK Competition Commission and Ofcom, the UK Communications Regulator. All of you are familiar with his academic work, but having engaged so much in policymaking, he makes it, I think, uniquely well suited to give us our views on how best the work of the type that we do together here can contribute and have the real world impact that we all hope it would have. And without further ado, I introduce Tommaso Valletti.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you everybody for having me. It's a real pleasure. Indeed, as he said, I was welcomed as I landed in Philadelphia Airport by two TV crews that they asked me, you're the first passenger from London, so what do you think emotionally? How do you feel about that? And I said, well, long life, I'm very sorry about her, but you know, I'm Italian. And then the crew said, oh, all right, so you're not the right person, next one. So that's my welcoming to Philadelphia. So it's great, it's a fantastic workshop, having people, computer science, economics, legal scholars, it's really something I'm very excited about. As Chris said, I'm an academic, but I had also a policy stint, being chief economist in the EU is slightly different from the role that, for instance, Aviv had, because it's slightly longer, it's 3 years, and it's not academic, it's really hands-on cases. But that's also something I enjoyed very much, running a lot of cases, including the cases that involve Google, one Facebook, one Amazon, etc., etc. But other stuff as well. So that was also quite revealing for me, and it was my reawakening sometimes to try also to see where I was coming from academia, going into policy, what was useful, what wasn't, to reassess some of the priors I had. And so it was a very interesting journey. I decided after that job not to engage in consulting work for companies. So I think it's important when you're at the crossroad with policy, there is a lot of money there, so it's always important you ask people to disclose. It's fine to do consulting work, of course, as long as it is transparently revealed. And I don't do any consulting work for corporations. I do sometimes help the CMA, which is a competition market, the enforcer of antitrust in the UK. So what I'm going to do I've got an hour, and you can interrupt me at any time. I'm very happy to have it as engaging as possible, and I will be provocative, otherwise Aviv would not have invited me. He knows what's going to come next. But I will make three main points. One, I would like to give you a broad view of the way I felt things were happening in the big tech industry, so really it's going to be a high-level view of the big tech, the top companies there. Then I will tell you, as long as, and I suppose this audience is very interested in having academic work which is useful for many applications into policy, I will tell you a little bit where I see sometimes a disconnect, where things can be changed, how it is helpful to engage with policy in a certain way, and I will highlight some opportunities and some problems. And finally, if there is time, I will point to a couple of recent examples of my research, with some research questions which I answered, which was my attempt to try to bridge policy and academia together. So, let's see if this clicker works. Maybe let's use this, if that is possible. Everything is stuck. Do you know what?
Here to help.
Oh, share screen. Very good.
Is there any video or anything?
No,
like that?
no, it's the right hand side maybe? Let's see. Good. So, we'll talk about big tech. I'm going to talk about what I have in mind is commercial internet, put it this way. So something that started about 30 years ago in the early 90s. Obviously the internet goes back many decades before that, but commercial internet started in the early to mid 90s, and I see two periods. This is my way, draconian way of cutting what's happening so far. So there was a first period of incredible, exciting work. Things were changing at a dramatic pace. It was about creating new markets that didn't exist before, connecting people in an unprecedented way, communicating and basically reducing, as an economist, transaction costs and making things much cheaper to happen. Markets were being created, information would be available to all of us. All the universal knowledge would be available to us to make informed choices. And ultimately it was a promise of democracy as well. No? And this is what there was this radical movement in Silicon Valley. These are young people in the mid-90s in Silicon Valley, and it was extremely, extremely exciting. Then things started changing in the second part of this 30-year period. So I'm talking about 2008, more or less, as a turning point. This is just very simple, of course. There's no pretense of doing scientific work. But it's a master's student who Dutch master student who was basically looking how the interface to the internet, to a typical search, has changed over time. So in 2010, if you search for this word, which is autoverzekering, I don't speak Dutch, but that means car insurance, basically. For a car insurance, you would have a lot of blue links on your screen, and then there were a couple of paid links at the top. Obviously, the red rectangles were superimposed, okay? You wouldn't see that because Google doesn't like you to tell exactly what's paid, what's not paid. There's a bit of ambiguity there. Over time, what this slide is saying, as you can see, more and more of our attention on the screen, because basically we pay attention to a screen, is captured by paid ads, okay? The blue links disappear. Another thing which I learned from doing things in practice rather than theory is that people don't go on page 2, on page 3, on page 4 of the search result. This is the Google shopping case that we ran at the EC. Basically 99% of the people stop on page 1. They never go beyond page 1. They never, just never. So again, it's important also when we think about ourselves, we are not representative of the average user. So when you come up with your own examples, great, but we are very tech-savvy people, but they are typically not what the average person in the market would behave. Okay? So this is basically, and again, open question, what you see on the screen, and this is on a desktop, by the way. On a cell phone, it would be even more because the screen size is even more limited, so your attention is grabbed by a small thing, and people don't scroll. People don't scroll, they just don't. They click on the first thing. So what you see is not necessarily the best result for you, but it's a result of an auction process, as you're very well aware. So what you see is the result of who's going to pay the most to have access to your attention. So this is something which has changed a little bit. And by the way, especially computer scientists would know this, but in 1998 paper by Brin and Page, when they're still doctoral students at Stanford, they actually wrote in their own paper, a search engine which is advertising funded, they said funded by ads, is inherently biased against the consumer. I'm quoting literally from what they said. So, of course, and then we know how history was slightly different than that. So something changed there. You can see graphically, I think it's just an element in the picture. So, and again, this idea that people would be going down, search for the perfect information, like in our models we have, and then make choices, is a bit different from the way many people behave. The other thing was, remember, again, you start your journey, stepping stone into the vast knowledge, and then you can end up by serendipity anywhere in the universe, in the internet. What this picture is saying is that 2/3 of our click are so-called zero clicks. So we're looking for some information on Google, we find it, so maybe that's good, but that's where we stop. So we never go outside the Google ecosystem, that's where we stay. So 2/3 is a big number. And again, challenging a little bit this idea that you can, in principle, yes, you can, but in practice, people don't. Okay, so you stay inside the Google ecosystem. Another interesting, just data points, of course, but they're also facts. Starting actually in 2007, 2008, 95% of the word searches are done from one search engine, which was Google, so 95. So another of our potential things that we say in economics, reversal of fortunes, competition for the market, maybe, but in practice for 15 years we had this dominance which is persistent. So it's persistence also, okay? So sometimes we like to always to come up with an idea, an anecdote that things will change, but these are the numbers, okay? And the numbers on mobile phones are even higher, okay? For a reason I will tell you in a moment. I don't want to pick up on Google, so let's go on Facebook. They call themselves Meta now. Remember in January last year, January 6th, the riots in Capitol Hill. I don't even remember that, so that was, obviously you do more than I. On the same day of the riots, another thing happened. WhatsApp unilaterally changed the terms of service for WhatsApp in the United States and other countries in the world. And de facto, that meant a reduction in the privacy that people would have, because you would be contacted, you had to agree, otherwise you couldn't use the service, and then business would contact you, etc., etc. So a reduction, say, put it this way, simplify, reduction in the privacy level. This did not go unnoticed. Lots of people reacted to that. They said, that's too much, they cannot do that unilaterally, that's bad, so let's do something. Let's migrate to other platforms where instead they care about our privacy more. Let's download Telegram. Okay? And you might have received a message from friends, you might have also downloaded yourself Telegram. And fine. And some people immediately said, you see, that's proof that there is competition for the market, reversal of fortune, it's very easy, just a little bit of coordination. Too fast. Ask yourself how many of you actually did use Telegram on a regular basis, even if you had downloaded. And again, you are the tech-savvy people here. Okay? And you had to convince your mom, your grandmother, all your chat groups, all their virtually impossible. So these are the actual number of consumption, not downloads, but actual text messages being sent. And what you see, number one and number two is Facebook, because WhatsApp and Messenger are owned by the same company. Number three and number four, take them out, because this is Chinese. This is China, and China is actually a completely separate market, so you cannot mix apple and pears. So you get, again, about 90% of all these messaging services are in Facebook, and Telegram is not even in the top 10 in terms of actual consumption, not downloads. Okay? Because, so the metrics are important. So again, this has been going on. Zuckerberg started bragging since 2007 that they had in excess of 90% of entire advertising in the United States over social networks. That's early on, so that's a long period. Okay? So think that this dominance has been going on for a while. So dominance, and also some of the typical things that we tell in economics: reduction of transaction costs, searching for information, rational choices, a reversal of fortune. Perhaps this is really the dividing line between theory and practice, because I've seen lots of inertia, lots of dominance, lots of behavioral biases in practice. Obviously, these are different firms, and people start saying, well, you cannot mix all of them because they do different stuff. True, that's absolutely true. I'm not going to deny that. At the same time, from an economics point of view, there are actually stronger similarities. So obviously, Google and Facebook are business models which are based on selling ads, so there is a strong unifying point. Instead, Amazon is, say, selling products on a digital platform. It's a digital marketplace. However, Amazon, for instance, and Google also have an economic point in common, which is self-preferencing. So Google, the shopping case and everything, Google Maps, Google may favor their own properties when you're doing certain activities instead of competing ones. And also Amazon, when they're selling products that they do have, that's the problem that you know, being both at the same time a referee and a player, an umpire and a player, because there is a tension there. There is an obvious tension. By the way, Amazon is increasingly successful in selling ads as well. So they make a relevant pot of money now from selling ads. to give numbers, Google is making about $250 billion from selling ads every year, per year. This year is going to be higher than that. This is the latest data point for last year was 250 something. And Facebook is a bit short of 150. They're not billion. They're not doing great, but they're still making a lot of money. But there is an analogy, as I said. Google and Amazon have this self-preferencing going on. Apple and Microsoft, they sell stuff, so this is different. But again, Apple has the same problem with Amazon and Google of self-preferencing. So one of the European cases that was going on was, as you know, there's also a discussion here in the US, Apple Music versus Spotify. So obviously Apple has a monopoly over the App Store, and some products pay 30% to be available in the App Store. Instead, Apple doesn't impute itself the same 30% when they are competing, for instance, in the case of Spotify, over music services. So there are more similarities also, despite the difference in the business models. Microsoft is interesting. Microsoft is interesting because, in a sense, it is the company that affects us the most. So you may or may not have a Facebook account. You may or may not have a Google account. But all of us are using Word. All of us are on Team. But the point is that Word is interoperable with our similar products, which is something which I will return on. And Microsoft was also de facto the last big antitrust case that the US had a quarter of a century ago. A quarter. In big tech, I'm not overgeneralizing it. In big tech, a quarter of a century is a long period. Now things are changing, obviously. You know, there's a change in the administration, and we will see what cases are. When we know the cases which are being brought up, we see how they go. But for 25 years, my opinion is that there have been very severe under-enforcement, generally speaking, in the United States, but in particular when it comes to big tech. And this is not related to particular political parties. I mean, this started, actually, perhaps unsurprisingly, it started with Obama. So this was, remember, up to 2008, there was lots of things happening. No one would have started an antitrust case against Google or Facebook at the time. It was far too early. But then, when dominance ensued, things were different, and they were big funders of the Obama campaign, so, as you know. So, in Europe, we tried to do many cases with various degree of success, and I will comment on that. Point for this audience is that from these cases and others, there is a lot of evidence that is often buried. Obviously, these are not academic papers. These are very boring decisions of enforcers, but there is lots of factual information there. So if you're interested in this, I would urge people also to read a little bit about the facts, because at one point I would say that it's very difficult for us academics to get meaningful information from these companies. So sometimes from these decisions you do see some numbers, which is useful. And there is lots. It's not just from the EU, but it's also, there's lots of things which happen in Australia, in the UK, in South Korea, in China. So surprisingly, China has been moving very fast in a direction of enforcing more against their own dominant big tech platforms for a variety of reasons. If you're interested, we can comment on that. So people say, okay, you run cases, but these are tremendously successful companies but because they were successful on their own merit. They are just good. And we like Google products. Some people like Facebook, some people definitely like Amazon, etc. So these are super successful. Yes, but antitrust cases would basically tell Google, if you are so good, why, when you are giving your Android operating system to a mobile phone manufacturer, they don't have the option of going for the iOS. They only have access to Android. Why do you impose onto them contractual conditions that would be fine if you didn't have market power, but if you're dominant, this is less fine? So why do you have to impose all your suite of products being pre-installed? And remember, behavioral stuff makes a big impact in these markets. People don't change the default, they just don't. On top of that, if you're so good, dear Google, why do you also pay $15 billion every year to Apple to be pre-installed as a search engine by default also on Apple phones? So this is going to make competition among search engines impossible. So how can you, even if you have a very efficient one, Android is foreclosed by contractual arrangements. Apple is foreclosed because you don't have the money when you start from a small size, even if you're very good, to pay upfront $15 billion. So how can competition emerge there? So this is one thing that the antitrust cases try to do. Okay? Try to go against this kind of behavior. The other point here is that some of this growth definitely came organically. Some may have come also through abuse of dominance. But some of this also came through unprecedented amounts of mergers. So there's been an incredibly large number of acquisitions. You will find different figures according to how they are calculated. Sometimes you find the number 400. 400 is in the number of acquisition in the last 10 years of GAFA without the M. But if you put GAFAM in the last 20 years, it's 1,000. It's in excess of 1,000. And again, it's a large number. Some of these are very small companies, but some were big. And it's a cumulative effect. It's a cumulative effect that makes a big difference. For instance, in the ad space, really the turning point was an acquisition of Google, by Google of a company called DoubleClick. And on top of that, there were other 5 or 6 acquisitions in the ad tech industry that really cemented the power of Google in the advertising, across the vertical chain. Okay? That's so 1,000, and I'm not here to say that they were all bad, but 1,000, now it's not 1,000 to 0 anymore, where 0 is the number of prohibitions that we had. The most worrying fact is that about 97 to 98% were not even vetted by anybody. For a variety of reasons, they were not even looked into. They just went through. Now I say 1,001 to 1 because a few months ago the CMA, which is the UK antitrust authority, blocked the acquisition of Giphy by Facebook, and it's the first time. So there's, as I said in our occasion, it's a small consolation to score a goal where you're down 1,000 to 0, and now it's 1,001 to 1. But it's a huge precedent. It has a huge value to see. It's been appealed so far. Facebook has lost the appeal, apart from one point about some information that had to be disclosed, and it goes on and on because of the value about establishing a precedent. So you can see that Facebook will want to fight this quite a bit. The EU ran several cases, imposed fines that for commoners like us look like big numbers. Cumulatively, Google in 3 cases was fined about $10 billion. But remember, they make $250 billion every year. So if there's a one-off fine, it's like driving in Italy. So you can also, sometimes you're caught, but the penalty is so ridiculous, you keep going too fast. So, and this is similar there. The most worrying things have been that these cases are very slow. The most extreme case of really not fast, but law enforcement was the Google shopping case. It took 7 years. 7 years. So it wasn't started by me. It wasn't started by my predecessor. It was started by 2 chief economists before me. It took 7 years to complete. It's been won in the first appeal by the EC, but they're still going on, etc., etc. So what's the point when all the other comparison shopping services by now are dead, basically a long time ago. It's very difficult to restore the competition which has been lost. The other point, which I've been very critical about of the work of the Commission, and I also I was part of that problem, is that the cases were quite solid in my opinion, but then there is a reluctancy from antitrust enforcers to tell the company what to do. What is the remedy? Okay, I fine you because that's an abuse of dominance according to the law. You didn't, the economics also support this. Fine, but you have to change your behavior. But how? Okay. And the EC until now has been very reluctant to say what to do. They use this phrase, which perhaps is well known in among legal scholars, which is cease and desist. So stop doing it. Okay, fine. And the lawyers like it because if I see you doing it again, I will bash you another time. But okay. But they're always 3 steps ahead of the game, no? So they're very smart, obviously. They are the smartest companies in the world, and they have top lawyers and top everything. So the remedies, the Commission hasn't been good at. This is my personal experience, and I'll comment on this also. There is unprecedented lobbying going on.
Does this mean you think there were effective remedies?
No. So far, for instance, in the Google shopping case, which finished in 2017, the Commission has not yet accepted formally the remedies they've been working on for the successive 5 years. They were ineffective remedies.
Based on?
Sorry? Based on the fact that you don't have comparison shopping services. You have more clicks on merchants, which are not via Google only. Okay, they emphasize on a metric, which is I don't think is a problem that this market brought about, which was unfair competition between Google Shopping and other comparison shopping services. The nice thing about doing cases also is that you have access to the internal docs, to the internal documents, and you can see a strategy, how it evolves over time. So in the Google Shopping case, for instance, you can see that it was a very thriving, these comparison shopping services. You're looking for a pair of sneakers, and there are sites which are going to tell you the prices, some characteristics. And it was a thriving market making money. We're talking about 10 years ago, because time passes. And Google had a product that was competing there called Frugal. So you don't even remember that name, Frugal. Frugal was a competitor, and they sucked, and they knew that they actually sucked. The internal documents say, we're really bad. We have to do something. So then they introduced another thing called Product Universal. And it was bad. It was also as bad. And so they said, we are not making it. They are much better than us. So you have documents saying, these guys are actually good, and we cannot make inroads. Then something happens in the about 10 years ago, when they do two things. They introduce the Google Shopping. They introduce an amazing thing which was new, highly graphical content where you see the pair of sneakers with the price, etc., etc. However, they're already dominant, and people like that. They see and they click on it, but they make it accessible to Google only. So only Google products would be shown into the box, okay, and not to any other guys. Plus, they also introduced something called the Panda filter. The Panda filter is a great thing that was introduced by an Indian computer scientist. There is a long tail of irrelevant results over the internet, as you can imagine, and the Panda filter was something to get rid of this of junk, put it this way, okay? But then in the shopping example, Google had an algorithm that said, if we have one of the products the consumer is searching in that moment, use the Panda filter to demote any rival we might have to page 10 of the results, irrespective of the quality of what they offer. Okay? So, as you see, so if you have a competitor, dump them in ways. So, this is something that killed competition between Google and the comparison shopping services. The remedy is basically as simply said, the box has to be accessible to everybody. That's it. The demotion system was not considered in the decision, for instance. And the remedies that they had simply are saying, okay, now we make the box available, and we are going to extract the profits from whoever is going to win the auction for this space.
Tommaso, if the court came to you and said, you are now the dictator, you could tell Google what to do, what would you tell them to do in the shopping case?
In the shopping case, I would have looked at the demotion mechanism. So making sure, so there was a lot of traffic, organic traffic, that was arising from searches via Google to these websites, and this traffic disappeared with the introduction of the Panda filter. So to me, that element would have to be addressed by any remedy. So making sure that the traffic, the meaningful searches to rivals which are good, they must appear at the top of the results. And this is something that instead the current remedies don't even look into.
Also, since they're asking questions, on an earlier slide, you pointed out that 2/3 of searches are no-click searches.
Yeah, according to this data source, of course.
How does Google make money if no one's clicking through?
So, but Google, this is how you engage with your customers. Your customers are not all the time online, and that's a profitable activity. Sometimes your customers which stay on your properties, they are going to purchase things, they're going to go somewhere, they're going to be ads, and then they monetize. But they don't monetize over those. Yeah.
Okay. That's non-monetized. You just make the money on the stuff they click on and the others.
That's right. So, the evidence. So what to do? And I have a slide for policy, and then I will start talking to the academics here. So, one is to use traditional tools. In a sense, some problems which are to be anticipated in industry which are characterized by strong network effects. We had them in our industries. Telecoms is obviously my favorite example in an industry I know quite well. So on the top right, you have the current discussion in Europe about the DMA. You have similar legislation in front of your Congress now. Obviously, there are differences in implementation, but the economic principles are quite similar. And it makes sense to concentrate on these two elements of contestability and fairness. What do I mean by that? So the problem of people trying to download Telegram but not using Telegram is clearly related to the fact that if you have Telegram, you can communicate with someone else only if they have Telegram as well. Okay? They are not interoperable. Instead, I suppose in the US it's the same. Take another industry. In the UK, there is an oligopoly among cellular operators. There are 4 of them, but if I'm not happy with one of them, what do? Well, I change my contract. I keep all my numbers. It's something called mobile number portability that came via regulation. I can communicate with anyone else, right? Because I can call you irrespective of which network you are on, and I keep my numbers, my contacts. So that it's really interoperable and interconnected there. So imagine how different it would be the competition arising. Big in Telegram, I have no idea what's the business plan there, but if Telegram could be also interoperable and interconnected, then the market would be more contestable. So this is the principle. It's not regulation like in the older days. It's about price regulation. It's not about that. It's introducing some changes to make sure that network externalities which exist and are useful, but they are enjoyed at the industry level by everybody, they don't accrue to a single player, which creates dominance. So this is contestability, and the analogy. There's a big difference since this audience is interested in privacy. We have to acknowledge that the problem of privacy did not exist the way it exists now in telecoms when we were implementing this regulation 20, 25 years ago. But we have experienced at least with a lot of this from the technical aspect. And fairness. What's fairness? And it is an interesting area of how easy it is to understand from people coming from regulation what we're talking about, and how difficult it is for people coming from a competition law angle instead. So, take again telecoms. I'm talking about the UK, which is the situation I know the best. There was there an integrated incumbent, British Telecom. British Telecom is integrated across the value chain. Vertically, it has long distance, local loop, etc., etc. It's integrated. Competition is possible in some elements of this vertical chain, but not everywhere, because it's too expensive to duplicate of the local loop. The investment there is just too high, and it's inefficient also. So the way the regulators intervene, we want to have some competition. You, British Telecom, who are the monopolist at the local level, for the local delivery, you need to give access to those who make a reasonable demand for it, and you cannot discriminate in your favor. Okay? You cannot charge them a zillion and nothing to you. You just can't. You have to. And so they did lots of work, how to do it. First it was called accounting separation, then was functional separation in some stages. In some cases they went even beyond that. But the reason is quite clear. You cannot give yourself an advantage because of your vertical structure. You have to treat your downstream activities in the same fashion you can treat anyone else. Okay? And this is not just for the price, but also on the quality of the engineers you're going to send to fix if there is a faulty line or something like that. And this is that on the regulatory side, economists agreed on that, and there is experience. And instead, when you go to the competition economist or the competition lawyer says, what's this thing? What's this thing? What's self-preferencing? That's the way it was called in the Google shopping case, but economics is the same, isn't it? No, you give access to the box only to yourself, but not to your rivals. That, from a regulatory perspective, would be anathema, in Europe at least. And so this is trying to to bring these regulatory principles that we have used in other industries also where problems exist these days, which are industries with strong network effects, lots of investments to get in, and lack of tangible competition over long periods of time in order to hope that competition will arise. So it's not a regulation which is there to say we're going to regulate the prices for access to these services or to advertising, but let's see if the market can develop, but we need to give competition a chance because competition hasn't had a big chance. The thing I put in green, and then I move on. Something that I'm very much, again, from an economic, to me at least, I don't want to say it's a general economic proposition, but it would make a lot of sense. I've seen in practice resources being employed in very inefficient ways. What do I mean? The way it works in antitrust is that you have this endless fighting about market definition up front. And you can imagine, on the other side, you've got the Google, the Facebook, etc., trying to define what's a relevant market, whether Google is dominant in that relevant market, but that is the process. And it consumes a lot of resources from the enforcers, a lot. To the extent that enforcers can choose to fight a few battles, because they cannot fight every battle, because lots of people are really dedicated to proving that Google is dominant over search or something like this, and to us it sounds like, why are you wasting time on that? Let's move to the substance, it's more interesting. So rebuttable presumption, what do I mean? I mean, you have to have a measure, of course, of what's the relevant market, but be draconian. Use some structural measure. Size, persistence of dominance, some numbers. Okay. Every number is going to be imperfect. Okay? So if we start saying, why 1 billion, why not 900 million, there is no answer to that. So we need to be a bit quick. And I would say, because you're so big, because you have all the resources, because you are almighty, I will presume that you don't need yet another acquisition or you don't need a particular behavior, okay? I will presume that you can do it by yourself. You can do this stuff without needing to, for instance, on the M&A side, without needing to buy yet another company. Okay? And I'm quick. That's a presumption. That's what the presumption is about. It avoids to spend resources there, unless, and then this is the rebuttable part, you come back to me. And again, it is these guys know what they want to do. I cannot, as an enforcer, have an idea of the business plan of Google or Facebook in the next 5 years. It's not my job. I'm doing, as a competition authority, one day I do pharmaceutical, the other day I do cement, then I do big tech. So they know better than I. They have the information. Okay? So, and then this is where they should rebut, if they want, prove to me as an enforcer that you need that merger, specific merger with that company, that you cannot do any other contractual arrangement which is less anti-competitive to achieve something and prove it to me, and then you decide where the standard of proof is going to be, in order to do something which is useful for consumers. Otherwise, I will not approve a merger. So this is something that I think would be a huge change for the practice of antitrust. So, academics, us, what can we do? I'll go through 3 slides on this and see where you stand, see how you react to this. I have a very contentious proposition there. I will elaborate on it. Of course. I think that economics has largely failed as a field when it comes to big tech. That's a big statement, isn't it? And why? Why am I saying this? Think of the way we were discussing about digital platforms 25 years ago. Again, when this all started, a quarter of a century ago. The first generation of models on two-sided markets were coming along. I even wrote some of the stuff, and it was applied to telecoms. We enjoyed them. But basically, what we were saying, these are amazing technological developments. We create markets that wouldn't exist before. Lots of efficiencies come around, lots of reduction of the search cost. This is where I started from today. However, because of network effects, etc., there is a tendency to monopolization, winner takes it all, or winner takes most. Okay? There is a tension there. There is a tension between efficiency and market power. That's the discussion we had 25 years ago. Now, I move forward to these days, to the policy debate we are having now. The debate is again the same. They're saying, oh yes, but these platforms are very efficient, they reduce search costs, they bring unprecedented stuff. However, there is a risk for monopolization. It's the same thing. And I have to be honest. I have to be honest with myself. Is this a successful story? Have we learned something if we keep repeating the same? So I would say it isn't. And again, think for yourself, and maybe you will be more on the defensive, or will tell Tommaso this is absolutely wrong, it's rubbish what you're saying. But this is the way I see it. If a quarter of a century later we still repeat the same things, we haven't learned, right, how to help the policymakers distinguish between these two aspects, the efficiencies versus the market power. And we're still there. And we're still there for some problems that we have. Oh, this is another example. Again, think again of two-sided markets and where we ended up in the policy arena. There was a decision some years ago. Every economist now is against it. They said this was rubbish, Ohio versus American Express. The implication of this, it's almost impossible to have any antitrust case in a market with two-sided market characteristics. That's the implication of that judgment. To the extent that people are saying we should go back to the Supreme Court, etc., etc., and now economists, I am one of those that said we should change it because that was a bad decision. However, this is a point of arrival of 25 years of economics, not necessarily done by academics, try to distinguish between you, but how the academic work was digested in the policy arena by certain operators, by certain lobbyists, by certain think tanks, etc., etc. So economics has been used de facto to create this precedent, which has basically, we cannot do any further cases there unless there is some drastic changes in the law. Okay? And this has been based on the way economics has been hijacked, perhaps. Okay? But we're there. So where were we when these things were happening? As academics, where were we? Why did it happen? What did we do? We didn't know. We're not responsible for it. Or are we? We are there. Now I'll try, after having been obviously a couple of kicks in the stomach, but then I will tell you also why I think it's not only our problem. In economics, at least, now we do empirical work, right? So in industrial organization, at least. So my field is IO, and in IO we do empirical work. Without data, academically speaking, you're basically dead. If you want to, because if you don't have data, you cannot publish according to, in certain ways, in certain journals, and you have to move on. And if you have to move on, you move on where you find the data. So you can do something that's, because ultimately we have jobs, you know, in academia, we have conventions in our fields that we have to follow. And here, even well-intentioned economists couldn't really look into what was happening because we didn't have access to the data. And so generations of scholars moved maybe even to other fields because it was impossible to study a question because we didn't have access to the data. When I speak about access to the data, I see two different kind of problems there. One which I call together with also Luigi Zingales the Uber problem, and the other one is a big tech problem. The Uber problem is some companies do give you access to the data. Okay? They're not the big tech. By big tech, I mean the top five, the big five that don't. Okay? I will comment on those. There are some others. Bookings, Airbnb, Uber, they gave access to some data to some economists. But somehow, the type of research question that you can address is preordained. So if you see a paper with Uber data, you already know, even without reading the paper, where the paper goes. Not that the paper is wrong, not at all, not at all. So you can react. So what's wrong with it? It's just that you can look at one aspect of the problem, and then that becomes a policy message. There is something else that we cannot do, but someone else will do it. But at the same time, the main message has gone through. The example that we do like is this paper from Uber that was trying to respond to the claim that there was gender discrimination among Uber drivers. In particular, male drivers were paid more than female. And they gave data to top economists who published this very well. And they said, no, actually, if you start looking at the data, you will find that the male drivers drive faster. And by driving faster, they just can have more passengers and they get more money. Okay? But it's not because they are male, but because they have more more passengers. Like an economist, you would say, okay, but there seems to be a trade-off there. If you drive faster, this is maybe more dangerous, right? Right. Okay, Google, can you give us data also to see whether there was the other side of the coin? Did that cause more accidents? Uber, who would have the data, would say you cannot look into that question. Okay? You cannot. So you have a partial view. There is no, and the message will be Google does not discriminate between male and female drivers. End of story. Okay? And again, this is those of us who have sometimes editorial position. You have to ask yourself, can you push it? So do you want to accept a partial analysis, or do you want to go for, I mean, is it acceptable that this kind of message goes through or not? Open question, I don't have an answer. And the big tech problem instead is the one I alluded to when it comes to competition. So I want to be very clear, I don't know other fields. When it comes to competition, Google, Facebook, Microsoft is an exception. Microsoft have Microsoft Research, and they do research. But Amazon, they never gave access to any data to independent academics over the past 20 years. You wouldn't find in the top 5 journal any article published with data from Google, Facebook, or Amazon on competition-related issues. Okay? You wouldn't. You wouldn't. Okay? And this is the problem I was saying earlier. And therefore, you had a generation of people that couldn't. Sometimes they go by proxy. Sometimes we have data about, I don't know, nice paper recently on dog-sitting platforms. Great. But how much can you learn about dog-sitting platforms, online dog-sitting platforms, and what is the analogy you can make where the problems are, which is the Google and the Facebook of this world? It's very difficult, right? So we need to have access there, which tells me, actually, these are very exciting times. The fact that we are here discussing it, it's an unprecedented level of interest. Perhaps we could have had it earlier if we wanted to have an impact on the policy, but there is still a very active discussion ongoing, and not just in economics, but also in competition law. The situation now is really ripe for much more research to be done, but then we need to get the right data. Okay? And I don't think, these companies are not charities, they don't do it because they love research as such. So this has to come via some regulation. In Europe, for instance, there is a provision, not in the DMA, but in the DSA, the Digital Services Act, that companies have to release data to the academics, to independent academics. You have to make a request, etc., every 6 months, for instance. Okay? And that's great, it's happening. And I think there are similar provisions here. The fact in other industries, we can do work on, I don't know, airlines, because information comes from the Department of Transportation. We could do some research on, I could do research on broadband in the UK because the regulator of COM would collect this information. You had a question?
I was going to say, some big tech companies open up data without regulation. Twitter's API.
You know, I'm talking about the big Google, Facebook, and Amazon.
Facebook has CrowdTangle and other things which are open, not full, but
so Facebook, we were discussing during the coffee break before. So remember, here we're talking about the last 20 years. So now they saw that there is a demand and also regulatory push to make this happen. So the last couple of years, things are changing. Okay? But remember, what have we learned in the previous 2 decades? Facebook also had this big mix-up on the data they gave, especially to people in journalism, to analyze whether Facebook would change the opinions where they are. You know, accidentally removed 50% of the data set, which was precisely where you would expect people in the middle that could have. So they just gave a data set without telling the researchers that there was a bug in the data that made all that research completely useless. And so it's careful there, very careful there. And as I said, things are changing a bit now, but I'm looking at 20 years. 20 years. It's not just from now. If, and I believe this is not necessary in this audience, but if you're interested...
There's a question online, doesn't sharing of data lead to privacy exposure?
It does, actually, it does. So, something which is not... Take health data. You can do this in different ways. There is a good way and a bad way. There is... Health data, for instance, the UK, the country I'm based in, allowed DeepMind, which is a great company owned by Google, to have access to primary and secondary care data from 5 different NHS trusts, hospitals, without asking for the permission of patients. Something's in breach of any privacy regulation. They said, we promise that using this data we'll diagnose your kidney problem, and I'm sure they will, but at the same time, millions of individual patient data were given to Google de facto. They integrated it in their Android system now, and nobody knows what they're going to do with it. Okay? This makes also Google have a lead in that market, because I ask my colleagues in the medicine faculty at Imperial, says, even if we ask as researchers to have access to similar data, they will say, never to us, never. So just for purely, not commercial reason, just research reason, we cannot have access to it. So I don't know what Google is doing. They're just ahead of the game by 5 years. And then this creates a competition problem. There is the alternative, going back, and so privacy was violated, and the competition problem was created, in my opinion. Then there is, for instance, Denmark. Denmark collects health data through an agency. These data are collected following all the protocols that the academic community has said that they are acceptable for privacy, because there are protocols, they follow the protocols. These data are available. Everyone, Google included, but other companies too, can train their own algorithm in the data sets, either make a request to it, but it doesn't create a competition advantage. Of course, if you have a better algorithm, it's yours, obviously. And then people make requests. They pay only for the pure cost of extracting the data, and different researchers, different companies can have access to that. And they try to solve the privacy problem via following the protocols that exist in order to do that. Okay? 2 different models. I think the Danish is preferred. So if you're interested in policy, I want to make you aware of something that sometimes we do with lots of good intentions, but this has specific implications if you are in the policy arena. So one thing is to we all end our papers by saying more research is needed, right? Right? I've written I don't know how many times. Please, I mean, be honest. How many times in your conclusion you say more research is needed? However, if you do this in something which is then brought to the policy arena, means that your research is going to be meaningless. Okay? Because you will immediately have somebody says, I mean, even this professor says that they don't know. So how can you give any advice on something you don't know, right? So if you're interested in policy, you have to become clearer about the implications of what you do. You have to become more assertive. More research is needed. It's a perfect, if you want to have an invitation from a policy forum where you don't cause any disruption, you do that, people will pat on your shoulders, will say, we even have somebody from academia, thank you so much. 5 years from now, when you're done with your research, come back and tell us again, thank you. Now we have to make choices, goodbye. Okay? Is that what we want? Question. By the way, if you're not interested in policy, that's absolutely fine. So I think that just doing research for its own sake, it's our job, which is great, okay? But then don't say, I'm doing this because of policy. You say, well, I don't know why I'm doing this, because I enjoy it, which is absolutely okay, But if you're interested in policy, becoming more assertive and being careful about what you write, if you do something like this, means that the impact that it has, you can forget about. Another thing for the theorist of us, among us. I don't know here, but in England where I'm based, I'm sure it's happening also here. We meet our peers, we go to the senior common room, we have lunch together, and then we have this kind of intellectual challenges and discussions where I never thought about that before. How interesting, how counterintuitive. How counterintuitive, that's something that I never thought about. Good, let's write a paper about it, fantastic. So, and probably you do write a paper. How many times have we done that? No? So among ourselves, and that's innocuous, that's fine, that's beautiful, that's fun, that's part of why we enjoy our job. But this attitude, when you go to policy, can have devastating consequences. Because policy is not about being 100% sure about something. It doesn't exist. Policy is about making choices under uncertainty. If you are 80% sure, That's great. That's fantastic. So this attitude means that without even wanting it, very often I've seen some very good friends, very good academics, which don't really know about what's going on in the policy, and say, Professor, forget about the details of the case. We're not going to give you the details of the case, but can you construct a situation where the most incredibly bad action by the worst firm in the world can be good under some scenarios? And let me think about it. That's an interesting challenge. And again, like our common room kind of discussions. But then this has implication for real cases. So, and this is a kind of, I would call it naivety by some of us. I cannot solve it, but people have to see through the consequences of their action, in my opinion. And I've seen a lot of this, especially on the theory side, because, as I said, very rarely we can have access to data, therefore we are just being, some proposition are being put in front of us and say, okay, can I construct something? Is it relevant? I have no idea because I don't have the data, but you ask me if I could construct such a scenario. You take it as a challenging proposition. Okay? And I think there's also a value system that you have to sometimes ask.
So, Tommaso, how do you reconcile that with your first comment? Because your first comment was basically saying, reach your conclusion and voice it without any, don't preface it, don't whatever. Here you're actually saying, you reach a conclusion, you're going to say it's counterintuitive. Instead of saying, oh, it's counterintuitive, maybe I don't think it's that relevant, you're saying,
But then you say it's, no. Then I didn't express myself. I say, in the first thing, you have to be more assertive. The second thing is, forget about the small details, because the small details do not matter for policy, actually. So, because you're not going to be helpful by saying, look, there is engage with your models. If you find that in a parameter space, one thing can happen, you have to think of also, but is this a likely, say whether this is a likely or unlikely situation. You have to say that. Instead, this is not what many people do. They just construct a case and say, you see, there is a case, therefore the burden of proof is on their forcer if they want to do something different, because I've given you an example where this could happen. So I don't think this is good counterintuitive equally interesting. On the contrary, counterintuitive equally interesting is something that can be easily hijacked by some parties in order to stop any enforcement.
Unless the researchers think, you call it a detailed, uninteresting part of the parameter space, they might actually think, hey, this is something relevant, I want to make sure it's relevant, I want policy makers to hear me, and therefore they're following exactly your advice.
But this is perhaps related to the third point. The way policy often is that lots of economics is not digested by you. That's the collective action problem that academics have. But it's digested by some specific think tanks, okay? And I call names. It's called the Global Antitrust Institute and the National Institute for Competition and Law and Economics, whatever, so at Portland, Oregon. There are places, especially in the US, which I had never heard of before as an economist, as an academic economist. And all of a sudden, as I jump into the policy arena, they are always present. They're always there. Okay? They're always there talking about economics. They don't talk about law. Maybe they do talk about the law, but they don't engage with the law. They talk about economics, and they are the only ones there which are telling that, for instance, there is a presumption that mergers are efficient. Hold on. I mean, where does this presumption come from? I thought that in the absence of efficiency, there is a presumption that horizontal mergers are always bad, and then sometimes we don't care about the small effects. That's a different thing. So there is some people that are doing that job. As academics, or another example, in vertical mergers, it's almost even in the guidelines, there is a presumption that the vertical merger is efficient. I thought as an economist there is a fundamental trade-off there. There is an elimination of double marginalization, and there is the foreclosure problem. How can that become a presumption, especially about vertical mergers which are among large companies, okay, where there is market power? And then I see that these guys have misread or misinterpreted, or I don't know, the literature that Francine Lafontaine and Margaret Slade had written something which had nothing to do with mergers, by the way, they had to do with something else, had nothing to do with a particular transaction that would be interest of competition authorities. And we were missing as academics, because why should we be present in front of the hearing of the FTC, the DOJ? Who goes there? Sometimes we are invited because we have a personal history, but as a group, we're not there. Instead, as a group, and I go to the counterintuitive, equally interesting, we need sometimes to say the academic findings on the basis of reading 30 years of a literature. Yes, there may be the counterintuitive result, there may be the small details, but on balance, that's where we stand. And that is something that is missing, and it's not easy to solve, because we don't have the resources, we don't have the coordination to do that.
I guess I'm slightly confused as to what kind of forums do you think this advice applies? Because almost, if I wanted to push back on this, it sounds like you're advocating for censorship lest somebody misinterpret what we're doing. Because are you talking about academic research and the output of that, or is this more for policy briefs or something? Because I can see that for the latter this makes more sense, but somehow that we would start limiting what we publish so that there's a concern for misinterpretation. That just seems...
So, but bear in mind that in policy circles, people are not able to judge, and maybe they shouldn't be able to judge, whether a certain result comes out from a paper in the American Economic Review or from just a working paper on SSRN. They cannot. But they would say, yes, Professor so-and-so in AR finds this, but Professor X and Y in SSRN finds that. It's one for one. So there is a missing point, I think.
But it seems like we should more directly solve that problem rather than limit what we publish.
But for instance, this would be very helpful, for instance, if journals, maybe not the top journals, but say Journal of Economic Perspectives, Journal of Economic Literature, now and then accepted to do some, to commission, or, because especially junior people don't have the incentives to do that, and I see, because you have to publish your papers in a certain way, otherwise you don't get tenure. But when people have reached a certain stage in their career, sitting down and saying, and having also the stature and the reputation to say something which is a more firm point on, and again, I would love to do it, Aviv may love to do it, but we have not enough time, we don't have the incentives either. So, and instead there are people which are paid to be constantly in front of the enforcers and repeat a certain narrative to them. And that's not the economics many of us would identify ourselves with. Okay? But that's the economics. It's not the economics that you do, I'm sure, but it's the economics they do hear about. And so either you get more engaged with, if you want, or there's something missing. So these are questions, Mark, I would like to discuss with you. And lack of disclosure, I started from this. This is my personal experience. There is an incredible lack of disclosure. And that's easy to solve in principle, but in practice, again, I've seen examples are useful. And for instance, take Carl Shapiro. He's a legend. I really respect him. Okay? And I like him very much, and he's great research. He's done fantastic work with Michael Katz, with Joe Farrell. He's done incredibly good work in the 90s, 80s and 90s. Carl was also chief economist at the DOJ, or how is he called, deputy assistant attorney. It's a very long name in the US, chief economist. When he goes to many conferences, not academic conferences, the conferences with the enforcers, which is a different crowd, he would say, I was chief economist of the DOJ. And he was, of course, but that was a long time ago. And then often he's talking about big tech problems, and he omits to say that for the past 20 years, he was the main advisor of Google in antitrust cases. And this is not a meaningful disclosure. Okay? This is a disclosure that has to happen in a different way if he's talking about. So in a meaningful way. Study relevant policy and counterfactual. I know that today you'll be presenting things on targeted ads, and some of you are working on this area. Here is something, what I mean by meaningful. An example I have in mind because I've seen research and people get very heated about it. So sometimes some of the experiments you're running are basically trying to say, okay, how much impression, how much money a company can make by having targeted technologies available, and let's switch them off and see what happens, and we calculate the difference, right? However, there is no policy that will ever be applicable to a situation like that, because no policy will say that unilaterally one company only will switch off targeted ads. Maybe there is a policy where every firm in the industry has to switch off targeted ads. So what's the right counterfactual? It's a right counterfactual not where ads disappear, then still be contextual advertising, you know what people are searching without having all this surveillance technology which has emerged now. Plus, this policy will be applied to everybody. So what you compute in your experiment, if you turn off something which clearly gives a competitive disadvantage to one and one from only, vis-a-vis the other guys which exist, of course, is different from turning off to everybody, so there is not, we all are in the same level playing field, right? This is going to have a very different implication. Plus, the cost of the ad will also adjust endogenously to what you can obtain. So, to see whether it's profitable or non-profitable, it's a long way before these unilateral effects can be projected to have equilibrium consequences. So think about, another example is when it comes to Amazon, and people like to quote Elizabeth Warren and breaking up Amazon, or not allowing Amazon to sell products online any longer. That's a very extreme policy, okay? So to have the counterfactual where you shut off completely Amazon is not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about, for instance, enforcing less discrimination, okay? This is what the policy is about, and it's not about going to such an extreme.
So Tommaso, there's a question about something you said a moment ago in the chat. If you propose presumption that vertical transactions are benign based on the vast empirical literature, what literature do you rest on to arrive at a presumption that mergers by large firms are presumptively bad? And to me, the legal person in me would say, the burden of proof sits one way or the other. And if saying that maybe they're overreading an argument on literature on one side doesn't mean that establishes the burden of proof flipping the other way. What do we rely on? How do we resolve this?
So first I said that simply having the current presumption that vertical mergers are efficient doesn't come from the literature. Vertical mergers involving firms with market power, let's be precise. This does not come from the literature. It doesn't exist. So the current presumption is wrong. So then you can say, if we had infinite resources, case by case. That's always the easy answer, isn't it? Right? On a case by case, let's see how it goes, etc. If we had infinite resources. My response in general, changing, is simply saying size. Size matters. Size is something that you can do many more things in-house rather than by, including a merger, a vertical merger. And then the rebuttal side, unless you prove me, not the agency, with limited information. It's a company that will give you exactly the data, and then you start engaging with the data, of course. It's not like we sit there and we're idle, we do nothing. But I think the conversation is going to be more productive. It's going to be much more, of course, this very successful and rich corporation will put the best economists, great, and let's analyze what they put in front of you, and let's discuss that. But this is not happening now. This is not even happening now. Do I need to finish? Yeah?
I think you have a third slide what academics can do, if I'm correct.
Okay, so a third slide, and then I'll stop, and I will present my research. Who cares about my research? So, and then, so I've written this in a piece for Luigi Zingales at the University of Chicago, if you're interested on this. So, the last slide, and then I will conclude, is really a call for interdisciplinarity. It's not paying lip service to this conference, which is great precisely because there are different vantage points, but because I believe that when it comes, for instance, to privacy issues, you really need the economists, the lawyers, the computer scientists, you really need this different level of technical expertise to have a meaningful conversation. When I started my job as an enforcer, I was basically told, instructed to say, well, anytime somebody's going to ask you about privacy, say, we care a lot about privacy, privacy is great, but privacy is consumer protection. It's not about competition. Give that answer, and that answer is going to, so you can be elusive, and that's the answer. But that is not satisfactory. So we need to stop the silos there. We need to stop the silos there, because clearly business models which are based on data collection, and data collection is related to our privacy. How can you study competition if you don't understand data collection and the privacy implication? You cannot do it. It's something that doesn't work. Self-reflection here. my friend Alessandro Acquisti has done lots of work on the privacy paradox. But again, the self-reflection, like I was reflecting myself on what we did on two-sided markets and where we are now, 25 years later, I hear Alessandro now, when he goes into policy circles, to say, yeah. So we did the privacy paradox. We did show that people give away their data for a slice of pizza. However, you know, real life choices are much more complex. In fact, people do care about privacy, and he's talking about the paradox. Oh, sorry, there is a typo there. The paradox or the privacy paradox. That's what's meant to be on the slide. On the slide. So it's not that people don't care. It depends on the context. But he had to do that, Alessandro. We had, of course, many conversations because he also saw how the research that he and others did was immediately then absorbed by some interest to basically come up with a narrative that people don't care about privacy in practice. They may say that in theory they do, you know, the original privacy paradox, but in practice they don't, okay? Which is something that was a very bad message for the policy, because this has allowed really to open the gates. And now the academics, but I think it's too late, they're saying, no, that's not what we meant, it was a different context, we asked certain questions, very precise, so we can run our experiments, but in real life, when you are accepting things online, it's not clear what you accept, there is lots of ambiguity in the way the text is being written, but it's also partly as a result of the research that we have done. Also, another thing which I'm here to push you. There's lots of economists doing research on GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, because finally we have a natural experiment that we can use in Europe, and but somehow the attitude of many economists is to look at the unintended consequences. GDPR was introduced to protect privacy, and people say, oh, but we cannot measure privacy. Today, perhaps somebody will tell me, but we haven't measured the benefits from it. So, and again, it's like the Uber problem. We do, the positive aspects, we don't look at the negatives. Here, it's the opposite. We look at the negatives, and we do not know about the positives. So, and an aside here, because I find it sometimes curious that even people which are very interested on the topic, sometimes they don't understand some important institutional details. So people, especially in the US, we are in the US, think that pop-ups were mandated by GDPR. We hate pop-ups, hence we hate GDPR, these pop-ups things. No. Pop-ups were actually an industry response to GDPR. It's the industry who hated GDPR that introduced it. And in fact, the biggest trade body in advertising, IAB Europe, has just been told that all the pop-ups that they introduced are unlawful. Okay? Are unlawful. They violate GDPR. So when we do, again, our diff and diff, let's try to understand what we are capturing, what's responsible for what is the response of whom, etc. And apparently, according to this, it's Google, Amazon, and others have been constantly unlawful through the pop-up system introduced by the industry, trying to abide with GDPR, and they didn't. So this is something that we have to think and also try to be factually correct. Otherwise, we don't understand each other. At the same time, these are where I'm pushing the economists. I'm also asking help through the legal scholars to help us. So when I talk to scholars in law that do research on privacy, they come to me and say, no, but you economists get it wrong, because the right aspect to approach privacy is to say this is a fundamental right. It's a fundamental human right, which is something where I'm naturally inclined to accept. Okay? It's a good term, it's a good word, and I like it. But I think also the law scholars need to help me, because we do measure things. What does it mean to be a fundamental right? Can I make trade-offs? Can I make comparison? Can you help me? So I need help from the lawyers also to put in practice some of these legal concepts that, as an economist, I struggle to understand what that can mean in terms of our research. So a conference and a workshop like this, I'm sure, will solve many of these problems. So thanks a lot. I will skip my research, and I say thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
And with apologies to people who were not able to ask their questions. Fortunately, Tommaso will be here the rest of the day, so please feel free to engage him on
So
that.
fortunately or unfortunately?
Fortunately. And we are very grateful to have you here. And I forgot to thank Aviv Nebo, who extended the invitation as a former chief economist colleague who made this all possible. So thank you very much. For those people who are getting CLE, the second word for this session is weather. And without further ado, Rakesh, you want to do the next one? Shall you, as a